Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bitcoin Curve podcast. My name is Aravind Shanmuganathan, and in today's episode, I'm going to take you through what I'm calling this episode, Defining Bitcoin Through Time. If you were to look online today, you're going to get hit with a raft of different definitions from different angles. And so the purpose of this video is A, give you a view of the entire landscape of definitions of Bitcoin as I see it today, the nuances behind them. I'm going to make the case that definitions that we're seeing today are going to be time dependent. And finally, I'm going to leave you with what I believe is my definition for Bitcoin today with a bit of a twist. So with that, let's dive into it. Now, if you were to go onto Google today and start to Google what is Bitcoin or the definition of Bitcoin, you are going to get hit with a range of different definitions from a range of different sources. And so to give you a bit of an example, I've got three with me here today that I've printed out. The first is when you do Google Bitcoin definition, you're going to get an Oxford Dictionary style result from Google at the very top of your search. And this is what it says. Bitcoin, a type of digital currency in which a record of transactions is maintained and new units of currency are generated by the computational solution of mathematical problems and which operates independently of a central bank. When you go down that search result and you get hit with another two, the next one you're probably going to find is Wikipedia. And Wikipedia defines Bitcoin as, Bitcoin is the first decentralized cryptocurrency. Nodes in the peer-to-peer Bitcoin network verify transactions through cryptography and record them in a public distributed ledger called a blockchain without central oversight. And the final one, just to set the scene, is from Investopedia. So what is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency designed to act as money and a form of payment outside the control of any one person, group, or entity. This removes the need for trusted third-party involvement, example a mint or a bank, in financial transactions. Now, while they may sound similar, there are a lot of differences between just these three definitions. And I wouldn't actually say that any one of them is wrong. But what becomes clear is that each one of these definitions is coming off the back of a different perspective depending on who is writing it. So as an example, the Investopedia definition came from an investor's lens. The Wikipedia was far more technical in nature, highlighting things like nodes, a peer-to-peer Bitcoin network, talking about cryptography and blockchain. And the Oxford-style dictionary definition was somewhere in between both that of a layperson and a technical person. And so this is where I'll cut to the chase in saying that while we may look at these as all definitions, and what's led to this podcast episode called Defining Bitcoin Through Time, I actually don't think that these are definitions, but rather these are descriptions dependent on who is describing what they're observing. And let me dive into that just a little bit more. When I think of a definition, I think of something that is objective, that is going to be the same regardless of who may be observing it. So whether, and we'll use an example here, I come from an IT and sales background, I should be able to have a consistent definition of Bitcoin when I compare what I think it is versus a marketer, versus a salesperson, versus a healthcare professional. Because the definition should be objective, which is why we've got a dictionary that allows us to define various things so that we can share that amongst the people of a population. But what I'm seeing here are more subjective perspectives as to what Bitcoin is and what Bitcoin does, taken from the lens of very different people. And so my belief here is that we're not seeing definitions, but rather we are seeing descriptions. So the question then becomes, why is it so hard then to find a consistent definition of what Bitcoin is online? And it comes to where we are in the technology adoption cycle of Bitcoin. Now, I go through this in one of my articles on my Substack, so if you haven't read my Substack or subscribe, please go there. The link will be in the description below. It's completely free of charge. But I go through the technology adoption curve, and I highlight where we are currently at in Bitcoin's journey to global adoption. Right now, we are sub 10% of the global population adopting Bitcoin. It is so very, very early. We're still in what we call the early minority phase of adoption. And when you are so early into a technology that is yet to create impact in a society, it is very hard to come to a consistent understanding as to what that technology is. And I say that with some level of confidence because when I thought on this, I realized that we have examples through time as to where we've seen something similar. And the best example of this is the internet. Because where we are today in Bitcoin's adoption is analogous to the internet back in the mid to late 90s. But you'll remember that the internet was this very ambiguous, very hard to define thing when you were starting to talk about it to your friends and your family. And when you did try to define or explain what Bitcoin was, we often struggled. But something did emerge through that period, which I think I'm observing now in how we're describing Bitcoin, and that is we tried to bring analogies in to help people understand what this thing was. So what do I mean by that? When you have a complex technology and a complex concept, it is very hard to just go by a technical definition to be able to describe what it is. We often need to bring known knowns that we know people are aware of and use that to help describe what this technology is. And in the internet, there were probably two key examples that come to mind. Now, granted, I was only, how old was I at this point? We're probably about 7 or 8 years old. Nevertheless, these were the things that I do remember. The first is the information superhighway. What you were able to do here with that analogy or description is you're able to take two things that are well known to the population to help describe what this technology, the internet, was doing. You had, on one hand, information, that goes without saying. And the second piece you had was superhighway. You break that down further, a highway is a expressway or whatever you want to call it that is much faster travel between 2 points rather than taking back streets or standard roads. And then now make that a superhighway, so implying that it's going to be even faster or even better than what the highway is originally. And you're able to take information, superhighway, to give you this analogous description that says the ability to shift information very quickly from one point to another. The other one, which we often see now everywhere, is what www stands for at the front of every single web address. So the World Wide Web. Now, when we think about that, we almost take that for granted as it's just www. It's just, the internet. But when you break down the word and you realize it's World Wide Web, we took web from the spider's web, which is an interconnected lattice structure that connects multiple points all together. And it is almost a perfect description as to what the internet actually is. And then we go worldwide. And so what we've done here is, especially in the early, mid, and late 90s, was use these analogies to help people understand what the internet was. Because I can tell you now, you will probably today struggle to define what the internet is. But because it's become so mainstream and we just know exactly what it is, we can just say it's the internet. And we have confidence that everybody is going to have a very clear understanding as to what it is, even if they can't articulate it themselves. And we only got to that point once the internet was broadly adopted by our global population. Now, back in the 90s, the internet was close to that 10, 15% population adoption. It wasn't until the late 90s, early 2000s that the Nordic countries in the US hit that 40% population adoption. But prior to that, we were still in that trying to figure out what this thing actually is phase. And so when you do look at the internet back in the 90s, I think there was an objective definition, and then there were these descriptions. Descriptions being the information superhighway, descriptions being the World Wide Web. The technical definition being the internet is the global system of interconnected computer networks that uses the Internet Protocol Suite, TCP/IP, to communicate between networks and devices. Now, regardless of how you describe it, that's an objective definition. It's a technical definition because this is a technology. And supporting that, we had descriptions of it, being an information superhighway, the World Wide Web. To bring that back to Bitcoin, I do believe that we are in that early adoption phase, and that's supported by data. We're well below the 15% adoption rate in most countries. Globally, in terms of the entire population, we're less than 10. There are only a few countries that are in the 20s. But needless to say, it is still a very small minority of the global population that's adopted it. And so we are likely in the same phase of the internet back in the 90s. Hence why we're seeing all of these descriptions trying to get the point across as to what Bitcoin is. But eventually, as we start to move into the early majority and late majority adoption phase of this technology, and I will do a video on technology adoption more broadly in the coming weeks, we will see a very similar result that we see in the internet, which is we've got the analogies and we've got a very well understood definition. So that then comes to, well, what is the definition of Bitcoin? This one might actually change, but my view is Satoshi Nakamoto gave us what that definition could be in his white paper. And it was the title of his white paper, which is Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. Very simple, very short, but I think describes this perfectly. It doesn't go into the technical elements of blockchain, consensus, nodes, and cryptography, and all the other technical elements that make up Bitcoin, but a peer-to-peer electronic cash system is a very succinct and easy to understand definition for Bitcoin. The problem arises as to where we are in Bitcoin's adoption. And not only Bitcoin's adoption, but what Bitcoin is trying to be in our civilization. When you read that definition from Satoshi Nakamoto, you see peer-to-peer digital cash system, and cash there being the operative word. But when we look at what cash is money, and we ask ourselves, well, what is money? Where Bitcoin is at the moment, it is not at the stage of being a money yet. It is not broadly adopted. It is not used as a medium of exchange yet. And its price is so volatile that it's unlikely to be that for a while. And I'm going to butcher this, and I recommend that you read Lynn Alden's book, Broken Money, to get more detail into this. But there is a journey that something needs to go on before it become a money. And right now, Bitcoin is also on that journey. So you've got this dual dynamic. You've got Bitcoin on a technology adoption journey in and amongst a population. And you've also got Bitcoin on a monetary adoption journey, which is outside of the technology, but being accepted as a money to the broad masses. And we're going on both of these journeys at the same time. And the other point being that it's not a guarantee that both journeys will be successful. So you could get a technology adoption of Bitcoin, but you may fail as it being a money. You might get both. But that there also brings us to where we are today. And so similar to the internet example, we are seeing these analogies to help describe what Bitcoin is pop up. And I want to run through that before I give you my definition. So the first one is Bitcoin is digital gold. In a similar way that we saw information superhighway, we've got digital gold. We've got the item gold, which is a known precious metal that we see, that everybody knows is a valuable commodity, and digital, which we all know. It's software. It is the ones and zeros. We've just got the digital, the software, the electronic version of gold. So the question then becomes, is that analogy, digital gold, sufficient to get the adoption of Bitcoin to where we need it to be over the coming years? And my answer to that is probably no. Digital gold by itself does not convey enough of an impetus of need for change. Because you'll see, like we see online with Peter Schiff, saying that, hey, gold is so much better than Bitcoin. Bitcoin is speculative. We do need to dig a little deeper. Otherwise, these hurdles that we're already facing and what the general public is going to be seeing and making decisions of I don't believe is going to be enough to sway them to adopt, especially at the rate that I would like them to see. And my personal goal with all of this work that I do is to help retail investors adopt rather than institutional investors. Because we hear this in the Bitcoin community all the time. This is one of the first assets ever in history that retail has been able to front run the institutions. But the time frame in which retail can front run these institutions is closing, because now we've already seen the infrastructure for institutional adoption being built. We've seen the ETFs, and we've seen massive inflows into these ETFs by the institutions, ETFs being issued by BlackRock and Fidelity as the two biggest examples. But now with the Trump presidency on the horizon starting January 20th, we're going to see the easing of regulation or by enforcement. So it's going to become far less hostile for corporations to start adopting. We're going to see what I would almost call nation-state adoption. We've already heard that Bitcoin may become a new strategic reserve asset. So that window for retail to front-run the institutions is very quickly closing. And digital gold as the only analogy that we've got that really resonates with people, I don't think is enough. And we do need to take people on that journey. And so this is the definition that resonates with me. The definition that I came up with, and there is a Substack article that I wrote about this, which I'll link in the description below, but it is Bitcoin is a scarce, secure, and decentralized digital asset. And the reason, and I was very purposeful with those words, and to contrast, this is Satoshi Nakamoto's title of his white paper being Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. I've tried to create as many parallels to Satoshi Nakamoto's title to the definition that I use when I describe it to people that ask me, what is Bitcoin? And so if I start to go through those one by one and give you my justification for each of those words, because I think words are important, especially when you're using it for a description or definition. So the first is peer-to-peer versus decentralized. The reason I went with decentralized is a well understood term by the general population, whereas peer-to-peer is very much more a technical concept. Peer-to-peer in IT, very, very well understood. But if you were to go out and talk to a sports person, healthcare worker, a retail employee and say, this is peer-to-peer, I think you're going to get inquisitive sort of looks of, I have no idea what you're talking about. Whereas when you say decentralized, it's literally the opposite of centralization. That as a concept comes across far easier. So peer-to-peer versus decentralized, I went with decentralized instead. The second one is electronic versus digital. Electronic cash system was what Satoshi described it. I believe that digital, as we're starting to see with a lot of media, both in the public sphere and the business to consumer space, as well as the B2B space, the word electronic largely does not exist in that lexicon, but digital absolutely does. And so digital, just as a term and as a word, is going to be far more meaningful to that audience than electronic. The next difference here is cash versus asset. I call it an asset. Satoshi called it a cash. I think this goes back to the point as to where Bitcoin is in its journey. This is not a cash or a medium of exchange broadly within our civilization yet. But it is absolutely an asset because we're starting to see people invest their fiat dollars into this as an asset. And I say invest because at the end of the day, there is still risk. And finally, the two other words that I added into this in order to help spark the conversation when I do talk to people is scarce and secure. I think that there is this notion that Bitcoin isn't secure, that it's easily lost. And so I want to bring the secure element to the conversation when I am describing this to people. And scarce is, I think, one of the most powerful words that we can use. And I think most of us would agree that the 21 million hard cap versus what we're seeing in the fiat system especially in the backdrop of where we are today in the fiat system with ballooning debts and the money printer consistently printing more cash into our systems to cover deficit spending. The scarce element becomes such a powerful descriptor for Bitcoin to get the masses on board, because they can understand that they're getting something that is precious rather than something that is the complete opposite. So if I bring all of this to a close, my description for Bitcoin today is that Bitcoin is a scarce, secure, and decentralized digital asset. But I also believe that that is the best description for what Bitcoin is for November 2024, and likely for the next year or so. But I know that given that we are on this adoption journey, both as a technology, as Bitcoin as the technology, but as well as Bitcoin on its journey to become a money, that description is going to change as that adoption progresses. So as Bitcoin becomes far more well adopted and well known by the general population, you're probably not going to need the scarce, secure, and decentralized. Bitcoin will just become synonymous of having those properties. Similarly, as this progresses from an asset to a medium of exchange, and hopefully one day our unit of account, that is similar to how the US dollar today is what prices all the goods and services around the world, hopefully one day Bitcoin is used as that unit of account. At that point, this is no longer a digital asset. This is back to Satoshi's header on his white paper. This is now cash or a money. And so I think we hopefully will get to that point. And so you can see how the description is absolutely time dependent. And that's what my scarce, secure, decentralized digital asset description absolutely is. It's time dependent for where we are today. And then I think you have your timeless definition of what Bitcoin is. Today, we could go and put a more technical definition forward, similar to what we saw in Wikipedia, or we could put forward it is a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, and hold true to what Satoshi Nakamoto himself put forward in his white paper. But there is one point that I want to leave you with. I made the case here that there is a big difference between a definition and a description. Definition is objective, description can be subjective and coming from the lens of the person providing it. And as we're going through this adoption journey, being aware that we are describing something that we observe rather than defining it becomes important, because you do not want to bring a level of rigidity in the way in which you communicate with people around the definition and being it's either this or it's not. Realize that we are all trying to describe something that is so new, that is being adopted by our civilization, and come with a level of empathy that the description can be different for different people. It has to be valuable for them to adopt. And so our job as Bitcoiners is not to set the hard rules per se, but rather find the description, the path, the value for the person that we're trying to communicate this idea to, and meet them where they are at, rather than expecting them to come to us. When you realize that what we're doing here is describing technology and we're not wedded to that rigid definition, suddenly we become more flexible, and we will be able to bring far more retail investors, those that are about in this early majority that we're trying to build, onto the side of Bitcoin, and so that we can bring them before the institutions, but more importantly as well, we can start to accelerate the adoption of Bitcoin more broadly within our civilization. And you've probably heard me use the term civilization more and more. I see this as not just for me as an Australian, or as an American, or as a European. I see this as the money for humanity. So I'll leave you there. Firstly, if you've made it this far into the video, a huge thank you for taking the time to watch and listen to this wherever you may be consuming this. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, if you could please like, subscribe, and share this, it would mean the world to me. as I'm just starting out, it will help build this podcast and get this message out to as many people as possible. Huge thank you again, and I can't wait to see you in the next episode.